Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 1. Today we are going to be tackling the Black Death, or as I have called it here, Europe's Great Biological Crisis. The Black Death will strike Europe in the 14th century, and it will sweep across the continent, killing most of those in its path. But what was the Black Death, and why was it so deadly? The Black Death was a deadly epidemic that lasted just 4 years in Europe, from 1347 to 1351 CE. In those 4 years, however, it's an efficient killer. It kills 1 out of every 3 people in Europe, 1/3 of the population of Europe. Some regions actually suffered an even higher body count. In some regions, 7 out of 10, 70% of the population succumbed to the Black Death. But what was it, really? The Black Death was actually 2 diseases that were related. On the one hand, there was bubonic plague. Bubonic plague was the most common form of the Black Death, and actually the least virulent, in other words, the least deadly. Experts estimate that bubonic plague killed about 50 to 60% of those people who got it. So just over half of those who contracted the Black Death died. It's a pretty horrible death toll, but just wait until you see what's coming. We know that bubonic plague was spread by the fleas that traveled on the backs of rats. The symptoms of bubonic plague included high fever, aching joints, a painful swelling of the lymph nodes, and dark blotches on the skin caused by bleeding that occurred beneath the skin. If you contracted the Black Death, typically victims would last for about a week before they died. The other strain of Black Death was another related disease known as pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague killed close to 90% of its victims. Remember, bubonic plague was 50 to 60%, so pneumonic plague was far worse for those who contracted it. It was spread by breath and by touch, and victims who contracted the disease would cough up blood and usually die within 1 to 2 days. Whichever strain of the Black Death one got, it was often deadly. In fact, Western civilization and its very primitive medicine was quickly overwhelmed by this crisis. But where did the disease come from? Well, one might say that it was caused by civilization. Civilization, remember, means a concentrated population. In other words, people living in cities. Now, a large population living close together is necessary for a plague, a disease that kills its victims so quickly. There has to be a ready supply of fresh victims, or else the disease will die out. Western civilization in the 14th century provided the perfect environment for this disease. There were tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people living crowded together in cities throughout Western Europe. This was the perfect environment for the Black Death to grow and thrive. Another element of civilization is trade, and trade also contributed to the spread of Black Death. That's because trade makes it possible for diseases to spread quickly from one group of people to another. Which leads us to the next question. Where did it come from in the first place? Well, scholars today realize that Black Death or plague was actually an Asian disease that originated in Mongolia. Mongolia is the region just north of China. But how did a disease native to Mongolia, a place thousands of miles from Western civilization, how did that disease spread ultimately to Europe? Well, we can answer that question by looking back at our last lecture on the Crusades. What was one of the benefits of the Crusades that we discussed in class earlier? Well, we talked a little bit about how the Crusades led to a growth in the economic power of Italian cities like Pisa and Genoa and Venice. These cities grew rich enough to begin expanding trade routes farther and farther east. Genoa even established a trading post on the Black Sea at Kaffa. You can see Kaffa is highlighted with the arrow in the map above. Now, that trading post, which was profitable for Genoa, also is going to prove to be very bad luck. That's because in the 14th century, Mongolian armies from Asia will surge into Russia. They will reach the Black Sea, where they will lay siege to the Genoese port at Kaffa. The Mongols were carrying the Black Death with them, and they infected the Genoese traders at Kaffa, who then brought the disease back to Italy with them. From there, it spread along trade routes from Italy into Spain, France, and England. So in conclusion, we've learned a lot about the Black Death here today. We've learned about the two different diseases that make up Black Death. We learned how deadly those diseases could be. We saw how civilization contributed to the Black Death, and we saw how the Black Death ultimately began as a Mongolian disease, but finally made its way into Western civilization with deadly effect. Now, the impact of the Black Death on Western civilization is not simply on the dead or how many people it killed. Actually, the greatest and longest lasting impact of this disease will be on the living. And we're going to cover that in the next lecture.